Hi, welcome to the fourth content week of the case study on youth in Soccer 1010. So this week I'm doing the kind of case study that tries to bring together some of the things I've been talking about throughout the previous weeks, and I'm going to focus upon notions of dissent, resistance, and do that through the examples of forms of riots that have happened over the past couple of decades. I'm going to particularly focus on the London riots of 2011 and talk a little bit about the riots in Cronulla in 2005. So if you remember, the first part is kind of more an introductory, broader overview. So if you remember in the week that I was talking about youth as figures, I spoke about one of the figures that young people are drawn upon within public discourse in particular is this idea that they're kind of a revolutionary subject. Now, as I pointed out then, this kind of stands in opposition to the other figure where youth are kind of in moral panics of being kind of vapid and lazy, ignorant and all that kind of thing. And research kind of points out that young people express a frustration with this kind of point of view. They're kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't. If they don't get involved in politics, they're labelled as, apolitical and narcissistic and lazy. If they do get involved in a form of politics, they're also often told by the kind of authority figures in their lives that they're doing the wrong thing. Don't be focusing on that kind of political stuff. You need to worry about yourself. You need to study hard and get yourself in the position to get a good job and all that kind of stuff. Maximise your life's chances. I remember a focus group that I did in my PhD research in the early 2000s with some girls at the Merewether High, which is academically selective. They were planning to go on the Harbour Bridge walk that was about Indigenous reconciliation at the time, and I think over 100,000 people did that. And when they did it, they got into trouble from their parents and from their teachers. Don't be doing that kind of stuff. Why were you doing that? You need to be studying and that kind of thing. So here the idea is that young people need to be, from this kind of dominant perspective, working on the self and not worried about too much of society. And they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. So Sukaria and Tanner's work kind of highlights aspects of this youth as revolutionary subject. And they've particularly done some interesting work around the kind of post-2008 financial after the financial crisis and the so-called Arab Spring and that kind of stuff. And they talk about how some of these kind of huge political social movements were often categorized as youth movements as a way of kind of denigrating them and kind of making them seem less important and maybe, in a sense, to kind of minimize the changes that were happening. They talk about framing kind of, this as a kind of through moral panics and through, them being youth-led movements. It does specifically ideological work, and there's a list of those things there on the slide that you can go through. That I also touched upon in the previous week. So here I'm kind of drawing on that kind of figure throughout the rest of the lectures, young people as a kind of threat to social order. And when there is events such as, riots, what that means and how that's dealt with and that kind of thing politically and in the media, and what are the sociological ways of thinking about that. So there's been a lot of work done about kind of public uprisings and what's come to be called riots. And one of the kind of, I think, useful ways for thinking about this, and a kind of deeply sociological way of thinking about this, is through the flashpoint model. And this shows us an array of different contexts, different factors that may come together that may produce a kind of social situation, an effective atmosphere, I suppose, that may be conducive for a riot happening or for a kind of huge scale public upheavals. So they talk about how there's structural factors, the material circumstances, how much inequality there is, what are the relationships between people, groups and institutions, the political ideological stuff about how people in marginalised positions in particular, and how dissenting groups are treated by institutions of power, whether they're overly confrontational whether they've been treated with random arbitrary violence and things like that. The police in particular are kind of seen as a key group. The interactions between marginalised groups and police is often a key factor and a key spark of when riots happen. There's the cultural, the ways in which different social groups understand the social world and their place in it. The contextual, this is kind of long-term, historical meanings of what's happening in a particular area, and also the more immediate stuff that's going on. Again, the relationship between groups and police is particularly important in terms of this kind of disorder. The situational, and this kind of the architecture of space, how the particular suburbs are designed, whether kind of people are living in really distinctive groups, whether there's spaces that are conducive for this kind of thing to happen. And then there's the kind of interactional, the dynamics of interaction between police and protesters. And you can see that if you look at kind of footage of protests, it seems quite often that the police are ones that are dressed up, ready for the violence, not the protesters. And this kind of can, lead to questions of who actually instigates violence at these things. So this flashpoint model, it kind of, in a way, it's a social integration model. It's kind of a functional model to kind of get us to understand the various social ingredients that may be conducive for something like a riot to happen. If we think back to the introduction, sociology, it's like Durkheim's understandings of suicide. Suicide is a thing that happens in society, and Durkheim did an amazingly huge kind of global study about what are the circumstances that may see higher or lower rates of that happening. The flashpoint model is a similar thing. It's kind of getting us to understand what are the social ingredients that may lead to something like a riot taking place. So in Australia in 2005, there was a huge social disturbances in Cronulla. There's some really amazing work in Australia done on this, often through the concept of moral panic and around the concept of Islamophobia. So the work of Scott Pointing, Shane Homan, Greg Noble, many others have done some excellent work about this. If you're interested, you'll be able to look that stuff up. What some of the research points out is that in some ways the Cronulla riots in Australia were distinctive in the sense that you could argue that the riots were actually performed by not a marginalised group per se. It was done by a bunch of kind of mostly working class white men. So this is kind of interesting in the sense that they're often the most marginalised in a society is the ones that are the kind of ones doing the upheaval, but in this sense, some argue that it was actually people that tend to dominate society through notions of hegemonic masculinity and whiteness and things like that. So one of the ways we can think about this is through Paul Gilroy's notion of post-colonial melancholy. Gilroy, particularly writing in Britain, and writing about how as something like colonial relations start to change and maybe diminish over time, and as previously marginalised groups, such as West Indian immigrants in the UK, African Americans in America, and particularly Muslims in Australia become more prominent in social discourse, maybe have some more emancipatory freedoms and less actual official forms of discriminatory racism. What happens is the previously dominant groups, particularly groups of relatively powerful white males, experience what Gilroy calls a melancholy, a kind of nostalgia for the past. They're looking back as if to kind of say that things are how they were in the past were better, and they experience this as a form of nostalgia and melancholy. What then happens, according to this analysis, is that those still dominant groups kind of react in various ways, usually reactionary ways, looking for the past to kind of come back, and this kind of creates all kinds of political upheavals. Some would argue that the rise of Hansonism in the 90s in particular is a good example of this in Australia. Others point to the notions of Brexit and the rise of Trump as examples of this. In terms of the ethnographic research done with Lebanese groups in the Cronulla riots, they actually viewed what happened in those days as a kind of hyper-real expression of the racism that they experience every day. So those poor people being attacked on trains by a huge group of angry white men. The young Lebanese men tended to kind of express that as basically just a kind of larger, more spectacular, more violent version of the racism they experience every day. So here, in particular, there's an analysis here over what the beach means and how, there's these kind of clashes between cultures of how the beach should be used and that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in Australian examples in particular, there's a whole realm of work around that you can find to write about or to know about that kind of stuff. So to conclude this part, I'd just like to kind of get you to maybe click on these links here before you watch the next section. They're examples of the first two are just footage of some stuff that was happening in the 2011 London riots, an example of looting and an example of London being on fire. And the third one there is a radio program done by a friend of mine and colleague, Alistair Fraser, who is at the University of Glasgow. And his work is about gangs and criminal gangs in particular, and the way that they have kind of similarities and differences throughout the globe. And that be kind of serve as an introduction, I suppose, to the way that I'm going to talk about gangs later. Particularly in the sense that the way that the notion of the gang is used as a form of symbolic violence when things like riots happen. Okay, thanks.